Why do you want to work in a nutty place like this? I don't. Yes, you do. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Well, why is Polaroid a nutty place? To start with, it's run by a man who has more brains than anyone has a right to. He doesn't believe anything until he's discovered it and proved it for himself. Because of that, he never looks at things the way you or I do. He has no room for small talk. He has no preconceived notions. He starts from the beginning with everything. That's why we have a camera that takes pictures and develops them right away. Isn't that what a camera is supposed to do? I don't know. Of course it is. It's obvious. But Land was the first person to think about it that way. I've been a photographer all my life, and I'm a smart guy, but I didn't think of it. It never occurred to me, let alone how to do it. That is a whole nother story. That is an excerpt from the book I'm going to talk to you about today, which is Land's Polaroid, a company and the man who invented it, written by Peter Wensberg. Peter actually worked at Polaroid directly with Land, starting at 30. He was actually describing, that excerpt was describing the job interview, the unconventional job interview that he had. And he wound up working at Polaroid for 24 years. I originally read this book for the first time all the way back on Founders number 133. So I spent an insane amount of time reading this week. I read this book, and I read the almost 500-page biography, reread the almost 500-page biography of Edwin Land called Insisting on the Impossible. And then for the last 2 days, I've also spent time rereading it's this book called Instant, The Story of Polaroid. It is a history of the entire company. And the reason I'm doing all this is, I've told you before, one of my main goals is to convince as many entrepreneurs as I can to study Edwin Land. And there's many good reasons to do that, but the two that stick out to me the most, first is that he is Steve Jobs' hero. He influenced the career of Steve Jobs more than anybody else. For Steve's entire life, from the time he was in his 20s when he's giving interviews, and I have notes on, to all the 5 or 6 different biographies that I've read about Steve, from the time he was in his 20s until he was dying, he talked about the importance of that Edwin Land had on his career. I just want to read something from the Steve Jobs biography from Walter Isaacson just to cover this real quick. And he says, "Then I read something that one of my heroes, Edwin Land of Polaroid, said about the importance of people who could stand at the intersection of humanities and sciences. And I decided that is what I want to do." Steve got to meet Land. So Steve was in his 20s, Land was in his 70s. He met him 3 times as he was building Apple, and he described the meetings as visiting a shrine. And so I think the obvious point is, well, if Steve Jobs spent time, his very valuable time, studying Edwin Land, why wouldn't you or I? So that leads me to the second reason that I'm rereading this book, and why I read 2.5 books on Edwin Land this week. I want to figure out, what is the easiest way to convince somebody to study Edwin Land by reading one of the biographies about him. And I think the best way to do that is if I could say, hey, if you could only read one book about Land, this is the one I would read. For the longest time, I was telling everybody, hey, read Insisting on the Impossible. It is the most comprehensive biography of Edwin Land by far. It is not the easiest to read. It is almost 500 pages. You have to be really into Land to want to read that. So after reading all these, I realized, hey, the book that I hold in my hand, this is the one. If you've never read a book about Edwin Land and you want to get started, this is the one I would recommend. It's half the size of Insisting on the Impossible, and it gives us more insight into Land as a person because Peter knew him personally. In fact, the book ends after they both have left Polaroid and they're hanging out and talking in Land's house. Okay, so I want to jump into the book. Also, if you haven't yet, after you're finished listening to this episode, go back and listen to episode 132, 133, and 134. They're all on different books that I've read of Edwin Land. I've heard from so many people about those 3 episodes. They were some of my most popular episodes. All right, let me jump into this. At this point, this is from the introduction. Peter's giving us an overview of the unique life and career of Edwin Land and why he is worthy of study. Polaroid as a company was for 45 years virtually synonymous with Edwin Land. He was its founder. He invented its first products and many of its products and processes throughout the 5 decades of the company's history. His titles during the period from 1937 to 1982 included Chairman of the Board, President, Chief Executive Officer, Chief Operating Officer, and Director of Research. So when I reread that paragraph, I thought of this fantastic quote that I found in a book about Steve Jobs describing how Apple and Steve Jobs were they're indistinguishable. And it said that Apple was Steve Jobs with 10,000 lives. Same situation with Polaroid and Land. Land was Polaroid and Polaroid was Land. I always felt comfortable speaking my mind to him. Many of his employees did not. He was revered to an extraordinary extent by most of the people who worked for him. And there's a few reasons for that. One, Land was a legitimate genius. Two, he's also extremely famous in his day for his scientific achievements. And then if you're working in Polaroid, you realize, hey, this guy started one of the great technical monopolies of his day and ran it for 50 years. And then Peter gets into, he accomplished all this, and he was a college dropout twice. He dropped out of Harvard twice. Land did not earn a college degree. The list of institutions, however, from which he received honorary degrees includes Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Carnegie Institute of Technology, New York University, Williams College, Tufts College, Washington University, University of Massachusetts, and others. He has received more medals and scientific honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the National Medal of Science, than most living Americans. So I guess I need to point out, this is an extremely old book. It's actually kind of cool because it was published first in 1987, and the copy I have is actually signed by the author, and he signed it on February 15th, 1988. So at this point, Peter and Land are still alive. Land dies a few years later. Peter just passed away, unfortunately, in 2006. So back to this, he holds more medals and everything else than most living Americans. The full list of his honors runs to over 3 pages. He holds 533 patents, second only to Thomas Edison, and he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 1977. And then he wraps up the introduction with an overview of his career and what this book is about. I joined Polaroid in 1958 with little knowledge of the company, but with a sense that I was embarking on an adventure. I began in advertising and promotion. In 1980, I became executive vice president and was given responsibility for technical and industrial photography. In 1982, Land cut ties with his company and retired to devote his full time to his laboratory and foundation. 2 months later, I left Polaroid as well. The subject of this book is Polaroid and Land. The span is 1926 to 1982. The period when the company and the man were inseparable and virtually indistinguishable. And then Peter has a random sentence here that I think is actually really important. It's something that I double underlined. And he says, I did not see Land as a legend, a tycoon, a genius, or a tyrant, although he was certainly all of those and more. From the first day I met him, he impressed me as a person who lived his life more intensely than the rest of us. Live life more intensely than anyone else. I think that's a fantastic idea. His lifelong friend, advisor, and mentor, Julius Silver, described Land as the most extraordinary person I have ever met. Now, why is that important? Why am I including in the podcast his mentor's opinion and his mentor and friend's opinion of him? It's because it's who Julius Silver knew. Since Silver had known Albert Einstein and Bernard Barnuk and many other of the 20th century's most interesting minds, egos, and personalities, his judgment is significant. And then I'm working off the same copy of the book that I used the first time I read. And so I come across my past highlights and notes. And this past highlight note is still really important. I wouldn't change anything about what I highlighted or what I wrote, and this was probably 2 years ago. Land's life seemed primarily a life of the mind. His great dramas were self-created and played on the stage, Polaroid, which he constructed for himself. If those productions did not begin or end as the supporting cast would have them, small matter to the principal player. His interest in our reactions was minimal, polite, sometimes kind, but limited by the great drain of energy necessary to sustain his own part. So that is the highlight I'd made several years ago. This is what I wrote. This is why reading biographies is so important. All of these people created their own world within the world. They were stars of their own movie. And that line, his interest in our reactions was minimal, is actually really important. What popped to mind when I reread that for the second time, is Claude Shannon, covered him all the way back on Founders number 95, and Alfred Lee Loomis from the fantastic biography Tuxedo Park back on Founders number 143. Both of them insisted on independent thinking. They would share their ideas with you, but they wouldn't waste any time trying to convince you that their ideas were correct. Shannon and Loomis, like Land, were stars of their own movie. Their life was going to go in the direction as a result of their own independent thinking, and the opinions or the reactions of other people were of no concern to them. So now I want to move to the end of the first chapter because there's this fantastic overview that you and I have talked about over and over again, that there's like this old maxim in human history that's usually darkest before the dawn. This is the state of Edwin Land's life and Polaroid, the company, right before the release of their greatest product. Up until this point, if I can use the words of D. Hawk, the founder of Visa, Land for 20 years has been a successful business failure. And I think it's important to spend some time here because this is something we've seen over and over again. Steve Jobs' career was like this. Sam Walton, think about when he started Walmart in his 40s. David Ogilvy starting his advertising career at 38. Enzo Ferrari struggling for almost 2 decades. James Dyson struggling for 14 years. In Land's case, it is 20 years of struggle before he gets his biggest break. The invention that makes his name known throughout history. And this is, again, the reason I think this is so important because everybody knows these names after the fact. But what's so interesting is they all have a decade, 2 decades, maybe 25 years of, they're not just sitting around with their feet up, they're constantly learning, they're trying to build businesses, they're having some success, a lot of failure, but they keep pushing. It says, listen to this, Land was 37. Now, how crazy is this? For all intents and purposes, like Polaroid has different names, like the Land Wheelwright Laboratories, it's essentially Polaroid, right? He picked the field that he wanted to focus on when he was 17 and worked on it till he was 70. So check this out, Land was 37. He had known since he was 17 that he would be a great figure of science and affairs. He had expected to be playing these roles long before now, but he had ultimately been frustrated each time the moment presented itself. So right before, and I'm going to go into more detail here, right before he introduces the most important product he ever makes, he is in a fight for his life. There's a good chance that Polaroid is going to be bankrupt. For 20 years, he had pursued the dream of a polarizing system to eliminate the glare of automobile headlights, only to be rebuffed time and time again by Detroit. He had tried to adapt the technology of polarization to product after product with only modest success. He had presented the movie industry with the greatest technical revolution since sound and color, only to be ignored and misunderstood by Hollywood. They're talking about 3D. Polaroid's the one that invented that as well. He was proud of the war record of his company. So World War II, I've covered this on, probably 50 different books on this podcast so far. Essentially, the entire American economy grind to a halt, went from producing things for the consumer to immediately producing things for the war. Polaroid was no different. So he had a huge increase in revenues because he invented a ton of things like millions and millions of goggles that soldiers used. In fact, General Patton appeared, I think, on the cover of either Time magazine or Life magazine wearing Polaroid goggles. He invented things for the U-2 spy plane, wind up inventing some of the first heat-seeking missiles. They were called the Dove missiles. Now they're called Sidewinders. It was just absolutely remarkable what he was able to do. So that's what they're describing there. He's proud of the war record, but brilliant as some of the wartime successes had been, they could not continue because the war is now over. So what is going to happen? The war ends. Your contract ends. I think they have 1,300 employees, something like that. He winds up having to fire about 1,000 people. He knows this is a race. There's a clock here. If we do not invent an entire new industry and a product that we can sell to consumers within 2 to 3 years, Polaroid is gone. So said this could not continue now that the national emergency was over. So that is World War II. He had staked the future of the company on an idea he called instant photography. The 2 years following the war had brought the company close to disaster. Sales had fallen from $16 million down to less than $2 million. I don't want to brush over this. Let's pause right there. His company, right before he introduces the product that changes the trajectory. This product is going to put Edwin Land on the list of some of the top 100 richest Americans. And it's coming at a time where his company is doing less than $2 million in sales. Worst of all, he had been forced to fire people, good people. From about 1,300 employees at war's end, Polaroid had shrunk to fewer than 300. All the training, all those marvelous technical competences were being dissipated and scattered. And before I go on to just an absolutely fantastic paragraph that describes the situation, the note I jotted down to myself when I reread this a second time. The parallel to Jobs is striking. Land, like Jobs, had to turn around the company he founded before they ran out of money. The field of polarization which Land had chosen as a boy of 17, upon which he had staked his scientific career, around which he had built and financed his company, to which he had devoted almost every hour of his energy for the past 20 years. That is an insane sentence. Think about that. He had devoted almost every hour of his energy for the past 20 years. And this is the most important sentence in the entire section. At 37, he had achieved everything to which he aspired except success. That line should give you chills. We know what's coming. He had been searching for a field that he could dominate without dependence on any entity except the American public, and now he believed he had found it. So that idea, too, I need to run this back, because we've seen this over and over again. James Dyson's autobiography on Founders number 200 is the one that jumps out to mind immediately. What he's talking about there with Land's like, hey, I need a field that could dominate without dependence on an entity except the public. I want to go direct to the consumer, right? He had spent decade after decade. He had an invention. Back then, this is, early, 1930s, 1940s, a ton of people were dying because it was very unsafe for driving at night, because Detroit had yet to discover a way to deal with headlight glare. And so Edwin Land had discovered a way. He basically had stuff you could put on the windshield and the headlights, and it would dim the lights of oncoming cars. And he says, hey, if you adopt my invention, we'll save 50 lives a night. That was the estimate of how many people would die because of headlight glare at night. But for his invention to succeed, he had to convince all the automakers at once, because it only works if each car has, like, the windshield has the polarizer and the headlight. And he just failed over and over again. He's like, I don't want to deal with that. I want to go direct to consumer. I want to be able to talk directly to my customer. I don't want anybody in between me and the customer. And I want to explain why this invention and the product that I'm selling will make their life better. And so that's what he's talking about. He's like, I need a field that I can dominate without dependence on any other entity except the American public. That's the same advice that James Dyson has in the autobiography. He's like, listen, if you're the one that invented the product, you're in the best position to sell it. The creator of a product is in the best position to sell it because they know the most about it. They put their most all their heart and soul into it, and don't let anybody else get in between you and the actual customer. So let's go to when he actually introduces his product directly to the customers. He's doing the most important product demonstration. So you've probably seen Steve Jobs' product demonstrations. The iPod, the Mac, iPhone, same thing. Edwin Land was a gifted showman. And he would, just like Jobs, he would rehearse these product demonstrations. They would stay up all hours of the day. They wanted to make sure that they got every single aspect of the product demonstration correct. So on the cover of this book is this picture. This is going to wind up being one of the most famous photographs in history. In fact, when you Google image search Edwin Land, a picture of him peeling back one of the first Polaroid pictures, which is a picture of his face, is one of the pictures that'll pop up. He's like, listen, I invented this instant camera. You no longer have to send your camera. You don't have to either, one, build a dark room, which very few people would do, and two, you don't have to now take a picture and then send it off to Kodak and wait a week to get it back. You can see your picture immediately. And so he takes the picture, says, give me 50 seconds. They're all waiting in suspense, and I'll pick it up there. He peeled the two sheets apart and presented them, all the media, and presented them a picture. A gasp riddled around the room. Land held in his hand a brilliant image of himself, the face only slightly less than life size. The New York Times reporter tipped over in his chair. In an instant, Land was surrounded by a wall of photographers and reporters clamoring for him to repeat this and explain how it was possible. In an instant, Land had reinvented photography, his company, and himself. Never was a birth so vividly recorded. The picture appeared in Life magazine 1 week later as a full page. So Life magazine at the time was the largest circulation magazine in America. It was one of the classic photographs of the decade, and it was reprinted in every photographic retrospective of the 40s and 50s that was published after. It appeared the next morning on the front page of the New York Times and, of course, hundreds of newspapers all across the country. And so they're gasping, they're tripping over themselves because, again, the idea that you could take a picture, like this is the world we live in, right? You take a picture with your phone, you see it immediately. Take a picture with any kind of digital camera, you see it immediately. That did not exist before Edwin Land. You took a picture and you're like, oh, I hope it's well, but I'll find out in about a week or two. And so Land also does something smart here that I want to bring to your attention. And it's this idea where you can describe, like, think about it. The product that you're making is just some kind of solution to a problem that your customer has, right? And the best way to describe the solution that your company created is just in human terms, one human to another. And what's happening is like they're all playing with the camera, and there's a picture taken where you immediately see that there was a mistake. So it says one of the images on the table in front of him showed only the top of his head and his fingertips. And he laughed and said, and now this is the most important part of what he's doing here, because he's going to describe his solution in human terms and then compare it to Kodak's, the status quo of his day. And he says, this is one of the most significant pictures we have taken this evening. It illustrates a very important point. If you're not satisfied with the picture, this new process allows you to retake. I'm going to pause there. This new process allows you to retake. In other words, the process I invented and what my product, the one I'm selling to you, allows you to do. This new process allows you to retake the picture immediately and correct the fault. You know that you have a perfect picture on the spot. You never need to be disappointed again. Okay, so now I want to go back 20 years so we figure out who Edwin Land was at 17. This is his personality and the people and ideas that inspired him. And this part is one of my favorite parts of the entire book because it gives like mini paragraph-sized biographies of all the different historical figures that Land studied and then influenced his work. So Land, like every other one of history's greatest entrepreneurs, they all wanted to know what was the great work that happened before I was alive. And how could I study that, derive insights from that, and build on top of that? Start where these people left off. And so he says science and invention consumed Land's attention. At 17, he was deeply concerned with how he would spend his time and intellect and what field he would make his own. He carried a romantic vision of science developed by omnivorous reading and the certainty that he would achieve scientific success. He was filled with impatience and frustration, and his mind was focused on the question of which scientific path he should follow. And so they just described Land's habit of omnivorous reading, something he continues for his entire life. There's this gigantic library at his house, gigantic library in Polaroid. I'll get to that more on that in a little bit, but these are some of the people that Land is reading about. Land admired Michael Faraday, who was one of the scientific heroes of the 19th century. Faraday had apprenticed at an early age to a bookbinder. In his spare time, he read all the scientific volumes that came through the bindery. Land is going to do the exact same thing. He's going to drop out at Harvard. I think he's 17 years old when he enrolls in Harvard, drops out his first year, and instead goes to the New York Public Library every day at the time they open, and he literally reads every book on light contained in the New York Public Library. And so in addition to Faraday, it goes over all these other people that he's studying at this time, and it talks about what these people were doing at this point in Land's life. So we're right around 1926. Land is, 17, 18 years old, and it says Thomas Edison was 79 and still creating. And before I move on to the other ones, this note I left myself is books are the original links. The heroes of your heroes become your heroes. Jobs studied these people too. I don't think I have an example of Jobs talking about Faraday, but he talked about Edison. The next person, Jobs talks about when he was inventing the Macintosh, he put it in historical context of Alexander Graham Bell's invention of the telephone. I think Jobs was like 22. He was extremely young when he was doing that. Alexander Graham Bell had died in 1922. Edison, Ford, the Wrights, and George Eastman had little or no formal learning. So he's just talking about all the different people that he's studying. The fact that this is why he felt so compelled. He's like, I don't have to, the college is moving too slow. And I think he says something very similar to what Bill Gates said. He thought that Land thought his classmates at Harvard were unserious. If you remember, I think it was Founders number 140, the biography of Bill Gates that I read, which is fantastic because it just covers the first 35 years of his life up until the Microsoft IPO. I got to reread that book soon. It's really, really good. But what was funny in the book was Bill Gates said he went to Harvard to learn from people smarter than him and left disappointed. So there is some element of that in Land as well. But what Land's realizing is Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, the Wright brothers, George Eastman, these are people that I'm studying and looking up to. They didn't really have, they didn't need to go to college. They taught themselves. They learned through trial and error and through experience. So he's just realizing that. He's studying Faraday, Edison, Alexander Graham Bell. In fact, what was fascinating is this sentence here is pretty cool. Bell made the first long-distance call in 1876 to a building on Osborne Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Land was to have his personal laboratory and office 66 years later. Henry Ford, at this point in Land's life, was 63 when Land entered Harvard, 16 years younger than Edison, whom Ford had idolized. At this time, Ford loomed as the greatest industrial figure in the world. He had built half of all the cars sold in America. Then he moves on to the founder of Kodak. I have an 800-page biography of him, of George Eastman. I haven't got to it yet. It is in the queue. I will eventually get to it one day. George Eastman was 72 in 1926. Eastman's film was indispensable to Edison for his motion picture work. It is amazing how many founders, and this is like clear throughout history, regardless of industry and anything else, how many founders knew each other. I think there's just something motivating to be around other smart and driven people. And if a lot of people, like if you can move yourself into a situation like this, some people can't yet, and I would say books serve this function before you can actually meet these people in person. But a lot of them know each other. In many cases, like these industries are obviously popping up around certain geographical locations as well. And so then Land starts talking about like what is all this studying doing to him. There was a great turmoil within him. He was searching for his field, the field that would make his name known to the world of science. He had read all of the scientific literature that was available to him. And then he talks about, this is hilarious, this is one of probably the most important book that I ever found. He says, I was fortunate enough to acquire Robert W. Wood's book, Physical Optics, which I read nightly the way our forefathers read the Bible. And what he's taking away from this reading is so important. He's like, hey, I'm that too. As I review the nature of the creative drive in the inventive scientists that have been around me, as well as in myself, I find the first event is an urge to make a significant intellectual contribution that can be tangibly embodied in a product or process. And that's why he picked polarized light. He says Faraday had moved the world forward 100 years. Edison had compressed genius and energy enough for 3 lifetimes. I picked field after field before I decided that the great opportunity was polarized light. It is incredible that he's making this decision at such a young age. And then check this out. This is why he wanted to do it too. Because again, he's not copying the what, he's copying the how. He's not saying, hey, Ford, Bell, Edison, Faraday did this. Let me just copy what they did. He's like, let me copy how they do it and apply their principles and principles that are unique to my own mind to a completely different field of study. And he wanted one that had a bunch of unsolved problems, one that he could make his own. This is a crazy sentence. The principles of light and how it transmitted had been studied and debated for more than 300 years. This is where I get excited because it never ceases to amaze me how all of these different ideas and thinking fit together. I just did, back on Founders number 261, right? I did these 2 volumes of maxims that the founder of Visa D. Hawk wrote when he was in his 60s and 70s. And I get to that, so I just read that, a week or 2 ago, something like that. And then that's fresh in my mind as I pick this book up and I reread it. So therefore, like I've changed, right? Because of this information, the words on the page are the same, but my interpretation of them are different. So he's like, the principles of light and how it transmitted had been studied and debated for more than 300 years. The author just spent like 5 or 6 pages going over Land's search of how to make an impact and the influences he had and all the ideas he had, and then summarizes like, hey, I'm going to pick this because it's an unsolved problem. There's a hint of like almost arrogance there. It's like, well, I can make a contribution in a field where people have been beating, the best thinkers of humanity have been beating their head against the wall for 300 years. Why is that so important to me? Because what did D. Hawk write in one of those volumes, Autobiography of a Restless Mind? He said the young, which is, we're talking about the young version of Edwin Land where we are, right? The young hurl themselves into vast problems that have troubled the world's best thinkers, believing that they can find a solution. It is well that they should, for from time to time, one of them does. That is a description of Edwin Land. That's remarkable. Okay, so I want to skip ahead to when he drops out of Harvard. His parents aren't happy. Doesn't matter. He decides to open up like a little laboratory, kind of like dingy apartment / laboratory. This is when I told you earlier that he just shows up at the New York Public Library. He's like, I'm just going to read every single thing on the subject and then begin my experiments. It says Land began his reading with fierce energy. He planned to devour the entire literature available on the subject of polarization and to reread everything that he had already found at Norwich, his old school, and Harvard. Now, this is one of the main lessons that I learned from Land. He concentrated ferociously on his quest. He's got a ton of fantastic quotes. One of my favorite quotes is this important, and I think it's really important today because we live in the age of not only infinite leverage, we live in the age of infinite distraction. And the people that are going to be able to focus and concentrate, it's going to be essentially like a superpower. We're almost going to be like mutants compared to other humans that are just given to distraction after distraction. So Edwin Land said, and this is so important, I feel like tattooing it on my head, for God's sake. My whole life has been spent trying to teach people that intense concentration for hour after hour can bring out in people resources they didn't know they had. That's a powerful idea expressed in a sentence. In fact, the book, I keep this quote from the book, one of the biographies of Edwin Land. It's called Instant Image, another super old book. That was Founders number 132. But there's a quote in that book that I screenshotted, and I keep that folder on my phone where I just constantly go back to if I want to review and remember things. And it was very simple, like how important it is. It's like among all the components of Land's intellectual arsenal, the chief one seems to be simple concentration. And so what he's trying to do is he's trying to invent the world's first polarizer. This is the very first, his very first patent, his very first invention. You could argue this is like the foundation of the entire Polaroid company for the next 50 years. He just constantly tries to apply this idea and this technology in different products. Now he's starting to hire other people. I need to bring something to your attention because it's just remarkable. One of the people he hires is Terry, known as Terry. He's going to wind up being married to her for 61 years. But at this point, they don't have a lot of money. They don't really have any equipment. So he is going to break into the laboratory at Columbia University. So it says, before long, Terry was accompanying him on nocturnal visits to a laboratory building at Columbia University. They climbed up a fire escape and went through a window that was usually left unlocked. There, for a few hours each night, Land had clandestine access to well-equipped laboratory. What jumped out to me rereading this for the second time is, think about, these are just the founders that came off the top of my head. These are other founders who also broke into places to use equipment necessary for their work. George Lucas, Bill Gates, and John Carmack. They did the exact same thing as what Edwin Land is doing here. And I think Bill Gates and John Carmack are the only ones that got caught. So from 17 until 20, he's working on inventing this polarizer. I'm pretty sure he gets it done. And then he makes at this point, I know he definitely gets it done, but I couldn't remember if it occurs after he goes back to Harvard or before. I think it happened before. So he goes back to Harvard at 20. This is really important that this happens because he's going to meet his first business partner, this guy named Wheelwright. And Wheelwright is actually going to be his instructor. So it says, Land had the ability to charm anyone who interested in him. He and Wheelwright had much in common. Neither was in awe of Harvard. Both had left on their own for an extended period to prove something to themselves and perhaps to their parents. They were brilliant, excited by science, unconventional, and filled with energy. Land was the brightest student in the course called Electricity and Magnetism, the brightest by far, Wheelwright had said. So Wheelwright is Land's instructor in that course. And so it's through that course, they wind up becoming friends, they wind up collaborating a lot, and then this is the beginning of what will eventually turn into Polaroid. They had developed a habit of taking long walks, talking in the dark, trying ideas out on each other. You know Din, so either people called Land, either Dr. Land or Din. He preferred, if he knew you well, to call him Din. That was a childhood nickname. No one called him Edwin. You know Din, I think you should have a real laboratory. Why don't you and I start one? I have some money and I can fund it. There was no response. So that's another thing about Land's personality. You would talk to him, and people he would think about what you're saying. And so it's not like a back and forth conversation. It's like there might be 5 minutes of silence. And you're like, is this guy ignoring me? No, he's thinking about what you're saying. So it says, there was no response. Din, how about starting our own lab? Wheelwright repeated. And Land said, an education without a degree. That's the way he thought about starting his own company, his own laboratory. Obviously, they're not starting a laboratory just to do science. They want some physical, like Edison, they want a physical manifestation of what they're inventing, something that they can sell, like a product that can actually make people's lives better. So the idea is like, I think about this as an education without a degree, which is really a great way to think about it, right? And this also demonstrates that Edwin Land had an inner scorecard. Land left Harvard for the second and last time. He was 1 semester short of completing the requirements for graduation. So this entire time, Land has been publicizing like his scientific findings and the results of his experiments. And because they're so revolutionary, they wind up getting a lot of attention. So he becomes pretty famous even when he was in his 20s. And this winds up being the main asset because they're still trying to figure out, okay, how can we turn the science that we're making into a product? Because of his like notoriety and his fame, there's a lot of people trying to like either recruit them to the research department of their large company, like doing an acqui-hire for the Land Wheelwright Laboratories, or maybe even saying, hey, why don't you dedicate your talents to academia? And so Land goes and meets with people and talks to people. But this exchange between him and his partner reveals, in my opinion, Land's obsessive personality. Land's growing reputation as a bright and unconventional scientist was their chief stock in trade. Wheelwright was increasingly worried that Land might be lured away. When Land returned from one of the visits to this place, Wheelwright confronted his partner. One of their research people told me that you want to work there. George, Land replied, I told you what it's like. They start at 8 o'clock and work until 4:30. Then everything shuts down and they all go home. They don't work on Saturdays or Sundays. They keep telling me I should work for them. Well, do you want to? Of course not. How would I get anything done? So the young company's main focus is this idea that Land has to remove headlight glare from automobiles, right? But in the meantime, they need to find a way to get cash into the company ASAP. And so this is where we see that Land, his entire life, he like even though he's considered like a recluse and an introvert, he's a gifted showman, and he's really gifted at the product demo. So it says the two entrepreneurs had been examining every possibility they could imagine, looking for a simple consumer product that would provide them with an income sufficient enough to allow them to pursue the automotive headlight project. And so they realized that polarizers, if they apply them to sunglasses, you have a product that is not only, one, inexpensive, but also better than anything else on the market. So they arrange a meeting with the largest manufacturer of sunglasses in America at the time. It was called the American Optical Company. And so Land decides to have this meeting, this product demonstration, at a hotel. He researches where the sun would be at the time of the meeting, gets a room that is in the right location, and brings upstairs this fishbowl with goldfish in it. And so this is what Land was thinking, and then a description of this very successful product demonstration. Land did not want to talk about manufacturing techniques and specifications and prices and quantities. He didn't want a negotiation. He wanted a victory. He wanted surrender. He wanted applause. And the way he figured out how to achieve those goals is like as soon as the representatives from the American Optical Company come into the room, they need to understand within a few seconds the value that my product provides. So it says, the three men walked into a room filled with blinding sunlight. As they squinted, Land said in a pleasant voice, I apologize for the glare. I imagine you can't even see the fish. Here, look through this. Land gave each a square of polarizer. As they faced the window, the glare vanished. There was the bowl on the windowsill. The goldfish were swimming serenely. This is what your new sunglasses will be made of, said Land. It's called Polaroid. So the company takes the name of their first product. These are going to be called the Polaroid day glasses. They were extremely popular. Polaroid winds up selling more than 1 million pairs in 1939. And so with some initial traction, they're like, hey, we need to go raise some money. George Wheelwright, so that's Edwin Land's partner, his dad had actually gone to Harvard with J.P. Morgan. So there's a hilarious story in every book that I've read about Edwin Land when Edwin Land meets J.P. Morgan. So they set up a meeting. It was just after there was a famous bomb attack on Wall Street in 1936. And so Wheelwright and Land are going to show up at J.P. Morgan's office. And it says, we turned up armed with all sorts of strange-looking packages to show Mr. Morgan. We walked in the door of his office and were greeted by 4 men with shotguns. So they have this meeting with J.P. Morgan. It doesn't talk about it in this book, but in another book I read from Land, they have J.P. saying, hey, listen, I'm too old to understand this stuff. Let me direct you at some of my colleagues. So he introduces them to people like Averell Harriman, people investing some of the Rockefellers' family's money. And so these investors help them organize into a company. They give Edwin Land complete control of the company for 10 years, and then they decide to just rename the company the Polaroid Corporation, and this was happening in 1937. And the date 1937 is important because it wasn't until 1947 that Land actually does the product demonstration for the very first instant camera. And so I want to fast forward to right before World War II, because I think this is really important. You have people that are incredibly smart, incredibly dedicated. They have a number of patents. They have a bunch of inventions that the world has never seen before, and yet they still have not achieved business success. And the reason this is important to know is because it's very likely that they would have been out of business if it wasn't for this Navy contract at the very beginning of World War II. So it says nothing told Land that he had yet built a business that could survive, let alone grow. They had solid polarizer technology. They could manufacture the sheet reliably and in quantity. They had gathered a superbly talented group of scientists. They had learned a lot about a lot of businesses: the automobile business, the movie business, the optical goods businesses, the lighting business. These are all businesses they tried to sell into, okay? Yet, though Land would not admit it, the only business they had mastered was the publicity business. So at the end of year party in 1940, he calls the entire Polaroid group together. It's about 200 people at this time. And he says the world was engulfed in war. The United States was not in it yet, but it would be in the war within a year. The Navy had offered Polaroid a research and development contract. Polaroid would devote its principal energies to defense work. And this is so important. What he did not tell them was that the United States Navy had saved the company. So he scales up from, 200, 250 employees all the way to 1,300. They do 8 times, 10 times their revenue. But this, he knows it's only going to be, this war's not going to last forever. I have a short window here. And on the other side of this war, I don't have any product I can sell to consumers. I have to invent my way out of this problem. And so the founding myth of the Polaroid camera comes when he's on a short vacation in Santa Fe, New Mexico with his family. He's going around for a walk. It says Land and his 3-year-old daughter, Jennifer, turned from a walk around the town carrying his camera. They had taken pictures, and it talks about, take pictures of his daughter, of the scenery. And as they sat down, his little daughter asked, "Why can't I see them now?" Land had no answer to the question. Their time together was cut short as he rose abruptly. He asked his daughter to look for her mother, and he set out walking again alone, his head full of chaotic notions tumbling one after another. His mind was now a whirl. Jennifer's innocent query was the epitome of a Landian question. So this is something that pops up over and over again in the books when you study Edwin Land. This is the definition of what they consider a Landian question. It took nothing for granted, accepted no common knowledge, tested a cliche, and treated conventional wisdom as an oxymoron. Remember Peter's job interview at the very beginning of this podcast, where it's like, listen, he thinks everything through for himself, doesn't believe in conventional wisdom, and won't believe it until he's actually done the experiment himself. So it's like, he accepts no common knowledge, he tests the cliche, and he treats conventional wisdom as an oxymoron. His first thought was to wonder why he had not asked the question himself. So it's in this night where he works out in his mind, and it just so happens his patent attorney is also on vacation. So he meets up with them. They go over everything that Land is thinking about over 3 hours to document the process. This winds up becoming extremely important because there's an entire book. I read this book. I think it's for Founders number 134. It's called A Triumph of Genius. Land creates a technical monopoly protected by patents. That's why he has like a 60% profit margin. Kodak winds up violating the patents. So there's an entire book that I read. It's very fascinating because it focuses on this huge patent, at the time, the largest patent infringement case between Kodak and Polaroid, which Polaroid wins. They win the largest judgment at the time. It has since been exceeded, but it was almost $1 billion. And they won because of Edwin Land's testimony, which is covered in that book. And something that also is helpful that Land couldn't have known, because this is, 30 or 40 years into the future where we're in the book. But he always, every single process, they were dedicated to documenting everything. They had signed and dated timestamps for all the experiments they're doing. They wanted to prove that what they were doing, no one else was capable of doing, and that they did it first. And that's why they deserve the patents. And so in the field of instant photography, the very first time they put pen to paper is this night in New Mexico. And so Land is on record saying, I can see it in my mind. Now we just have to figure out how to do it. And this is what he talks about. I'm going to just read one paragraph, but really I'm going to read the note I left myself first because I think this is very fascinating. It says, the very practical reason why you should keep learning and keep collecting experiences. You will use the knowledge for an opportunity far into the future, one that you cannot see yet. And Land describes that perfectly. 3 years of work lay ahead of him, but he was sure he knew that what had to be done. And that's a direct quote from Land. What is hard to convey in anything short of a thick book is the years of rich experience that were compressed into those 3 years. So he's talking about the 3 years it took for them to create the actual product so they could sell it. It was as if all that we had done in learning to make polarizers, the knowledge of plastics, the preparation of microscopic crystals smaller than the wavelength of light, the laminating of plastic sheets. He's just describing a series of experiments and the knowledge derived from those experiences that he was doing for the previous 2 decades, okay? Had been a school and a preparation both for that first day in which I suddenly knew how to make a one-step dry photographic process, so the invention of an instant photography camera is the way to think about that, and for the following 3 years in which we made the very vivid dream into a solid reality. Again, that is a very practical reason why you should keep learning and keep collecting experiences. You're going to use that knowledge for an opportunity you can't even see yet. So then they go into the detail of how to build the camera. A lot of this stuff I want to skip over, but the important part is that there's a main theme that just reappears over and over again in the history of entrepreneurship, and that is the need for speed. They all move incredibly fast, and one way to go fast is to have tight feedback loops. So his main assistant on this project is this woman named Doxy Muller, and this is the tight feedback loop. Each day, Doxy Muller's telephone rang at 6:30 a.m. sharp. Land gave her his critique of the previous day's work and outlined her tasks for the current day. So Doxy's going to get this call at 6:30 before she leaves at night. She summarizes every single experiment, everything that the lab has done in this regard. Land will wind up reading these pages at like midnight. The guy doesn't sleep, or he like takes naps throughout the day. Like you'll find him in his office sleeping in the chair for like 2 hours, and he'll just go for like 60 hours at a time. He's insane. So, anyways, he's reading these reports at like, let's say midnight the night before, figures out what he wants to do the next day, calls her at 6:30, and then that feedback loop. There is not a single day that they're going to waste. They can't. They're going to go out of business if they don't figure this out. Before she went home, she wrote up her day's report for the SX70 research file. Land had expected it on his desk that evening with any sample pictures clipped to it. Land lay in his reclining chair alone at midnight, studying each one like the fragment of a treasure map. And so the entire development process of this project, you can think of Land just constantly finding different ways to push the pace. This is what I'm reading to is like spread out over multiple pages, okay? So this is how he talks about you need to work with a sense of urgency. And he's like, listen, it is taking a big chance, but there's a possibility that the Navy contracts will be canceled. In any case, now that the war is over, we have to develop another business as fast as we can. It will be a race, a close race. If we win, we survive. A race to finish the camera before we run out of money. So they're having a conversation. There's another executive named Bill, and he says, I'm going to call this guy tomorrow morning. And Land says, no, call them tonight. And so this goes on for a while. Even with Land pushing the pace, even with Land working 7 days a week, he understands. The note I left myself on this page is very fascinating. It says, burn the boats, a lesson on human nature. So Land would do what he's about to do here several times throughout his career, and his employees hated it, but it winds up working. Everything seemed to Land to be moving with maddening slowness. He decided to light a fire that, in fact, he might not be able to eventually control. The winter meeting of the Optical Society of America had been announced for February 21st, 1947. Land told his employees at Polaroid that they would disclose the camera system in New York on that day. They were appalled by the audacity of even considering a date for a public demonstration. So in other words, the people that know how far along, they have an intimate knowledge, how far along the product development and the project is going, and they're appalled that you're even considering that. Land calmed their apprehension by describing it as an occasion to present a scientific paper. His associates did not believe that he would limit the presentation to just a paper, and he knew it. In truth, Land's plan extended well beyond the scientific paper. He is literally burning the boats. He knew how daunting were the hundreds of interlocking problems Polaroid faced. The survival imperative of the company was clear and present to them all. They had no alternative but to succeed with the camera. Everyone left at Polaroid knew that. At the present rate of decline, the business, the company, and their jobs would not survive 1947. Land held on to this date as a weapon available for use against his own people, including himself, when their efforts slowed, as he knew they would. That is why I wrote, this is a lesson on human nature. Even committed men and women flagged. They needed an additional stimulus. Sometimes survival wasn't a sharp enough goad. Public exposure could be compelling, even terrifying. His people were all capable of more than they knew. Land would prepare the paper, but there would be much more on the night of the 21st. They would succeed. They would overcome nature. They would be ready. So they get the camera finished. They can barely make any of them. They're like, we need to start selling them immediately. Remember, they need money. They're going to go out of business. So they make 56. Okay, and they have this fantastic product demonstration. I've explained it on a few other podcasts, but just in case you haven't listened to those yet. They're like, hey, we're going to start in one department store. It's Jordan Marsh's in Boston. And they just do a product demo. So, two guys from Polaroid show up. They have 56 cameras and then one demo model, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. And they wind up standing up on the counter and saying, hey, look what we're doing. And just like the same response that the reporters and everybody at the demonstration where they gasp, like, please do this again. Anytime you would demonstrate instant photography, in the case they start doing it in Jordan Marsh, they do this all over the country in all different retailers and all different events. The public's response was always the same. They're like, how did you do that? I want it immediately. So they're going to wind up selling. Let me just read this because this is Land's outrageous prediction for the first year's sales. And so Land is talking to the people that are going to the department store the next day. This is the day after Thanksgiving. How many cameras are going to Jordan's tomorrow? Asked Land. 56, but obviously we won't need that many. And so the people are saying, hey, we're bringing 56. We're not going to need that many. There's no way we're going to sell that. Land said he didn't believe that. He's like, well, the salesman may need them all. And then the response from his employees, well, they'll need them all eventually. Hopefully we sell out by Christmas. They don't sell out by Christmas. They sell out in a few hours. People clamor. There's shoving matches. They're just, I'll take the demo if you have it. I'll just give me, they were so blown away by the ability to take a picture and immediately see it that they sold out in an instant. That is not really the reason I'm telling you this though, because it's the juxtaposition between Land's thinking and his employees, right? They're like, oh, Land's like, they're probably going to need them all. They may need them all. They're like, oh, hopefully we sell it by Christmas. And then they're like, well, how many? They have this discussion. This is the night before the product demonstration. And Land just comes out and says, he's like, I think we can actually sell 50,000 cameras in the first year. And it says the grandeur of that statement set them both off. So at the same time I'm reading this book, I'm reading Insisting on the Impossible. I'm also reading Instant, the story of Polaroid. That is going to be the next podcast. In Instant, the story of Polaroid, there's data that's not in the book that I'm holding in my hand. They do tell the same story where it's like, oh, he said 50,000. And people are like, this guy's freaking crazy. Land's is he there's a thin line between genius and crazy, right? We must be working for an insane person. He actually underestimated. If I'm not mistaken, they sell 900,000 cameras in 5 years. Think about how remarkable that is. You are on the precipice of bankruptcy if you don't get this done. Your company, the company you've been working for 20 years, is gone. You go from that low point, that valley, to within 5 years, selling almost a million cameras. And because you've invented the industry that you're operating in, it's not like, okay, if anybody else sees somebody selling a million of anything, they'll jump in and compete. You literally can't jump in because he's patented everything. And so not only are you selling a million, you're going from nothing, almost the precipice of bankruptcy, to selling a million units of your product, but you're selling them and the film at excessively high profit margins. So then we skip ahead to where Peter discovers Polaroid. Okay, this is almost a decade later. They're hugely successful. Let's pick that up. He says he was told, Peter is told by friends, hey, you should look into working at Polaroid. Peter was really gifted at advertising promotion. He says, I just like selling things. I like adding up the score. That's what he was interested in. And so his friends they're in Boston. He's like, you got to go check out this crazy company. It's like a 101 and it's run by this crazy genius. Polaroid was a huge company in my eyes with annual sales of $65 million in the photography business and the sunglass business. The two industries didn't seem very closely related, except that they were both consumer products. The company was run by a genius named Land. So that is the reputation that Peter is being told by his friends. And so Peter is wandering around all the offices of Polaroid. He's getting ready for that job interview that he wasn't even expecting it to be a job interview that I read at the very beginning. I just want to point out one thing because I think this is extremely important. So he walks around, he stumbles into this giant library. He's like, what the hell is going on here? And so the host that's about to introduce him to his interviewer says, Peter says, I was looking at the library. And the guy says, it's the company library. Land has a thing about libraries. We've always had a company library as long as there's been a company. He has a collection of photographic books in his own office, all cataloged through the central card file. There are 2 full-time librarians here. And I just want to pause here because this is a very important idea that pops up over and over again. If you even just forget going through all the 270-something books that you and I have covered on the podcast so far, right? Let's just talk about the people that in the last 2 months, entrepreneurs need a library. You probably already have one, whether it's on your phone, whether it's a collection of books, whatever it is. The constant building and the accumulation of books over your entire lifetime should never stop until you die. It pops up over and over again. D. Hawk, founder of Visa, talked about on the podcast just with him. He had 5,000 books. Ben Franklin, the one I did on him and George Washington, he had 4,000 books. Bob Dylan talks about a huge part of his autobiography is him. First, he didn't have money, exploring his friend's library. J.P. Morgan, Jay Gould, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Rick Rubin, Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, Edwin Land, Steve Jobs. They all had an extensive library that they utilized. It is a tool for an entrepreneur. There's several examples in this book where Land is thinking about a problem. He goes to the library and tries I remember reading about this, and goes and finds it. In fact, before I started recording, I was rereading over past highlights this morning. And I came across something I had forgotten, and it comes from the biography of Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx. This was the book I covered all the way back on episode number 151. Fred Smith created one of the most difficult, if you listen to that podcast, you already know this, and if you read the book, you know it even more. He created one of the most difficult, Federal Express was one of the most difficult businesses to create in history. And what was remarkable is as he's building it in the 1970s and 1980s, Fred is reading 4 hours a day while he is building his company. It says Smith estimated that throughout the 80s, he spent at least 4 hours a day reading. He found he relied quite heavily on his own vision, backed by assimilating information from many different disciplines all at once. So this quote I'm about to read you from Fred Smith is describing why, in the midst of building his company, one of the most difficult businesses to build ever, he's thinking it's a smart idea to read 4 hours a day. And he says the common trait of people who supposedly have vision is that they spend a lot of time reading and gathering information, and then they synthesize it until they come up with an idea. So again, if I read something, right, I spend my day, I read every day for this podcast. If I come across these ideas that pop up over and over and over again, and the people don't know each other, they work in different industries, they existed in different parts of the world and at different points in human history, and yet they're doing the same things, I am obligated to bring that to your attention. Entrepreneurs should have their own library. Okay, moving on. What is even more remarkable is, okay, you can have these excessive hours he had when he was 17, more excessive hours when he's 37, on the precipice of, going out of bankruptcy. He never relented. This is many years later. We're in 1962. This is how more on how Land worked. Land was sleeping in his lounge chair, his feet elevated, an old blanket pulled up under his chin. When I opened the door to his office, he had been working until a few hours earlier in the laboratory. He and a team of 12 had put in 18 hours interrupted only for tea, cookies, and lamb chops. Land believed in feeding the brain. A lab technician might occasionally faint from exhaustion, but never from hunger. Land hated to stop working. He is a man obsessed. Once begun on a course of action, he wanted to experiment until the hypothesis was proved. He would not entertain the assumption that his hypothesis might be disprovable until and unless it was actually disproved. He worked like a predator, stalking a solution with perpetual patience and perpetual energy. His intuitive leaps had landed him on the neck of his prey too often for him not to believe that he could do it the next time and the time after that. Although his assistants, this paragraph is going to remind me of Jeff Bezos in the early days of Amazon, and I'll tell you why in 1 second. Although his assistants were sometimes more than 20 years younger than him, he regularly worked them to exhaustion and continued with fresh replacements for hours longer. Many of them had graduated with no scientific background. Land proved many times over that a bright young liberal arts student could learn the routines of the laboratory and the structure of a scientific discipline as rapidly as applicants with technical experience. He liked the fact that his students had little to unlearn, but he did not tolerate corner cutting or sloppiness. So this idea where he's working so hard, they're tiring out, they're passing out, then he just gets in new recruits. There is a line in Jeff Bezos's biography that says, if you're not good, Jeff will chew you up and spit you out. And if you're good, he will jump on your back and ride you into the ground. So 30 years after the invention of the first instant photography camera, they create the SX70, which is considered the best, like the fruition of Land's dream as he saw it 30 years earlier when his 3-year-old daughter asked, hey, why can't I see the picture right now? So it was this constant iterative improvement for 30 years. I just want to bring something to your attention because this happens over and over again. Like, humans are really bad at predicting the future. And that includes, like, we sometimes think that the market is smaller than it actually is. And so at this point in his career, Peter is made the head of marketing. The previous head of marketing is like, oh, I'm going to leave Polaroid. I think we've saturated the market. He did like this market analysis. He's like, okay, we could only, at the very most, based on the size of the population and how many people have already bought cameras and how many people are just not interested in buying cameras, at most, we're going to sell 8 million more cameras in total. And Land didn't believe that, and Peter didn't believe that at all. And he says, when I took over the marketing reins, we sold 3.6 million cameras that year. The next year, we sold 4.6 million cameras. We sold, remember, this guy thought, we're at the top of the market, 8 million total, that's all we can do. We sold between 4 and 9 million Polaroid cameras a year, every year, for the next 10 years without reaching market saturation. From this evolved two theories. First, Edwin Land was correct to ignore conventional wisdom. He was teaching the American public that the Polaroid camera was not a lifetime acquisition, but an evolving idea, an ongoing adventure, an exploration of technology. So you would buy one. Polaroid had like this cult following. You'd buy one. 3 years later, you realize, oh, there's another, like they've made it a little better. So you buy another one, even without getting, in many cases, not even getting rid of the first one. And so in many cases, some of these people would have, some of these fans of Polaroid would have 5, 6, 8 different cameras. And so the idea, it's like, it's not a lifetime acquisition. You don't buy one and you're done. It's an evolving idea, an ongoing adventure and exploration of technology. Second, we knew with considerable certainty that amateur-owned cameras had an average life of 3 years. Thus, if we continue to change camera designs every 3 to 4 years, the pattern would continue. So now I want to tell you how Edwin Land was similar to Walt Disney. The SX70 had, at Land's insistence, it was covered in leather, and nobody wanted to put leather on a camera because it's kind of a pain in the ass, it's difficult. But Land thought that plastic wasn't good enough. So it says this was so typical of Land to insist that the camera be covered in leather. Not a leather look-alike plastic, but real leather. Expensive, hard to handle, difficult to bond to the surface of the camera body, but it smelled good and it felt good. Land had an instinct for packaging. He listened to all the arguments about the cost being $3 a camera more with leather, and then he overrode them, and he was right. So when I reread that part, since the first time I read this book, I read this fantastic book. It's a biography of Walt Disney, but it focuses on, if you ask Walt Disney at the end of his life what he was most proud of, he didn't mention cartoons, animation, nothing. He said he was most proud of the fact that he was able to keep control of his company because he lost control of his first company, right? And the second thing that he was most proud of was Disneyland. He thought Disneyland was his greatest achievement. And Disney's Land, the book that I covered on episode number 158, is all about all the process that went into building Walt's life's greatest achievement, right? And there's just a paragraph. It's so funny how you never know. Like, you just, like, what you read 400 pages and there should be a sentence or a paragraph that just somehow louches onto your brain and never leaves. And this is an example of that, where there's an insane amount of pressure that Walt Disney's under. He's got a deadline, just like Land had a deadline, running out of money, nothing's on time, but he's going to open regardless. And there's this interaction between Walt Disney and one of his employees that I've never forgotten. I'm going to read from the book Disney's Land. It's a fantastic book. It's written by Richard Snow. Highly recommend reading it. They were among the first of the park's attractions to be finished. So there's these stagecoaches that Walt and one of his employees are working on. And this employee makes the mistake of trying to get Walt to compromise on quality, which Edwin Land would not, and obviously Walt Disney's not going to either. They were among the first of the park's attractions to be finished, but the pressure of time was already weighing on everyone. One day, John Hench stopped by to check the progress of the stagecoaches and had an idea, which he brought to his boss. "Why don't we just leave the leather straps off, Walt? The people are never going to appreciate all the close-up detail." Disney refused and treated Hench to a tart little lecture. "You're being a poor communicator. People are okay. Don't you ever forget that. They will respond to it and they will appreciate it." Hench didn't argue, and he said, "We put the best damn leather straps on that stagecoach you've ever seen." That is a point that came up in conversation the other day that I was having with a friend of mine. Behind every single great, long-lasting company, the Disneys, the Apples, the Rolls-Royces, the Ferraris, you had somebody like that. The founder was like that. Unrelenting, refusing to compromise on quality down to the last detail, even on parts where, one, it was impossible for the customer to see or unlikely for the customer to see. And then I want to pull out Edwin Land's deep belief in the individual capacity of greatness. And I think what he says here really speaks to why founders are so important. He extolled the importance of the individual's contribution. Ptolemy, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Faraday, Maxwell, Einstein, rather than science as a group effort. This is a direct quote from Edwin Land. "There is something warm and appealing and cozy about this picture of the human race marching forward, locked arm in arm and mind to mind. There are insecure people in life to whom this vision of progress by phalanx brings comfort and strength. But I, for one, think this is nonsense, socially and nonsense scientifically. I think human beings in the mass are fun at square dances, exciting to be with in the theater audience, and thrilling to cheer with at the California Stanford or Harvard Yale games. At the same time, I think, whether outside science or within science, there is no such thing as group originality or group creativity or group perspicacity." So I had to look up that other word, perspicacity. We understand he's saying, listen, there's no such thing as group originality, group creativity. That makes sense. So perspicacity is the quality of having a ready insight into things. Shrewdness. So he's saying there's no such thing as group shrewdness or group insight either. I believe wholeheartedly in the individual capacity for greatness. Profundity and originality are attributes of a single, if not singular, mind. So profundity, I had to look up that word as well. That means deep insight, great depth of knowledge or thought. So profundity and originality are attributes of a single mind. And then the book ends with this meeting between Peter and Edwin Land at Edwin Land's house, and it's absolutely fantastic. Land was asleep. He was talking to me, and he fell asleep at the end of his sentence. His eyes closed. For a moment, I thought, but then they stayed closed. I sat quietly and looked at him. He was no longer chairman of the board, chief executive officer, president, chief operating officer, or director of research. He had resigned and retired. He had sold his stock. His last tie with Polaroid was a contract which guaranteed that the office and study that he had occupied for 40 years would be his for the rest of his life. I had left as well, he in August and I in October. I didn't have to ask him if he had regrets. He didn't have to ask me. We had both been at Polaroid for too long. Land for all of his life, I for 24 years. But of course, I told myself, the point is that only change is unchanging. We both had a longer ride than most people get. Land ran his company longer than any of America's great business leaders. Longer than Thomas Edison, longer than Henry Ford, longer than George Eastman. Giving it up had been the hardest thing he had done in his life. It had been an emotional trauma that engulfed everyone near him. None of us escaped. We watched as Land tore himself away from the most important thing in his life. The lines in his face were deeper than they had been. His silences lasted longer. His eyes more often focused inward. He accomplished this surgery on himself as he did most things, in his own personal, unexpected, and passionate way. He had written something in one of the annual reports in the 70s that was hovering in the back of my mind, but I couldn't bring it forward. In 1940, he had been named one of the National Modern Pioneers. It was a singular honor. He was 31. He had worked without ceasing, without deviating, for 14 years since boyhood to become what? A pioneer was as good a name as I could put to it. He wanted to create new things. The polarizer and the instant camera would remain the best known, but perhaps his most original invention had been his company. It was no less the product of a conscious process of experimentation and insight and repeated failure and creation and ultimate success than had been the other inventions. In the slow of the Depression, he was already shaping the idea of a new sort of corporation whose characteristics were so unusual as to be bizarre and almost ludicrous. At the time when steel companies, automobile factories, and textile mills were slowing to a halt, spilling workers into the streets, he was talking and thinking and writing about a company founded on science that would design new products not imagined by the public, which would be attracted to the products because they filled an unperceived need. He wanted a company to create an environment for art at a time when many were worried about meeting the next payroll. He talked about a company where the work life would be so satisfying that workers would look forward to the day beginning and regret its end, while sweatshops were in their heyday and unions fought to establish basic rights on the job. These were the ravings of a pioneer. Land opened his eyes. He looked into me. I had the feeling of being examined, interviewed. "You were asleep, Din," I said. I was a little concerned. "Nonsense. I was resting my eyes for a moment. Why would you think I was asleep?" "Well, I spoke to you and you didn't answer." "I was thinking." He smiled. "There is nothing more refreshing than thinking for a few minutes with your eyes closed." "I suppose that's how you survived all those board meetings," I said. I rose to take my leave. "Din, what was it you wrote in one of your shareholder letters about the future? About the past and the future? I can't bring it to mind." The smile disappeared. He brought it to mind instantly. "The present is the past biting into the future." "Why do you ask?" And that is where I'll leave it. For the full story, pick up the book. Speaking about the importance of entrepreneurs building out a library. Every entrepreneur's library, I think, needs to have at least one. I have, 4 or 5 books on land. And if you're only going to have one book or a book to start with, I would start with this. If you buy the book using the link that's in the show notes, you'll be supporting the podcast at the same time. That is 263 books down, 1,000 to go. And I'll talk to you again soon.